A big part of my career has been looking at the therapeutic value of the 12 steps because the 12 steps really have harnessed some powerful psychological forces that creates an amazing change in our life. What is that change? Well, the truth is that the 12 steps are engineered to help us achieve emotional sobriety, to achieve true independence of spirit, to achieve autonomy, to learn how to take care of ourselves. These are things that we don't know. Emotional sobriety really helps us learn how to have a healthy relationship, how to have union with the preservation of our integrity, how to cooperate with integrity. Most of us get lost in our relationships. Most of us do a lot of things we don't want to do. We don't really know how to show up in a good way. Emotional sobriety is about learning to have healthy relationships.
Well, we're continuing going through my new book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety. We are on the second insight, which is living consciously. And I've shared for the last couple of weeks, and Roger is going to come in now, and he's going to take the lead tonight. Next week, Herb Kagan's going to come in and share his ideas and insights into living consciously, and then I will wrap that up in 3 weeks. So Raj, come and join us. And I'm looking forward to what you have to share tonight.
And I am trying to unmute. Can you hear me?
Yes, now I can hear you.
Great. Okay. Thank you, Alan, for that, and Declan. So I do want to continue our discussion tonight of emotional sobriety, and I want to kind of take a page out of Alan's playbook. He reminded us all, or you did, Al, that this is a workshop. And so I'm going to ask to have you focus tonight on the personal meaning of emotional sobriety for each of you. And I'm also going to ask you to think about, in 2 or 3 suggestions that I make, how those suggestions can apply to your life, to your issues. For those of you who've been with us for this workshop for some time, you've heard us talk a lot about living more consciously. We've talked about it with respect to the 12 steps and emotional sobriety. We've talked about it with regard to raising or building our self-esteem and emotional sobriety. So you've heard us describe psychotherapist and self-esteem theorist Nathaniel Branden's ideas that living more consciously involves improving our conscious contact with reality, and that living more consciously is a choice. Those are 2 central ideas. That living more consciously involves doing our best to identify or see what truth is as best we can understand it. And it also involves making a decision, showing willingness to face what we would rather not face, take a look at what we would rather not look at, and very often feel what we would rather not feel. He goes on to say that living more consciously also involves using our intelligence, our mind, to actively address our problems in order to try to find solutions. It involves learning to be in the moment, being present-centered, in other words, but in a way where we don't lose awareness of the bigger picture of our context. It involves learning to distinguish between facts, our interpretations of those facts and the meanings we give them, and our feelings. It also means noticing, as I mentioned a moment ago, and confronting impulses that arise in us, and they certainly do in me, often, to avoid realities that feel threatening or that make me feel insecure, and instead choosing to face those realities as best we can. Finally, it involves becoming willing to see and correct my imperfections and mistakes, something else that's hard on my ego and hard on our egos, right? Developing a lifelong attitude toward learning and frequently asking myself if my words and my actions are in alignment with my purposes and my values in my life. So those are some of the parts of living more consciously that you've heard us talk about. When I mention using our intelligence, our mind, our consciousness to try to identify and own and address our problems, I don't just mean our cognitive abilities, our rational, logical, problem-solving abilities, although those are certainly a big part of it. But I mean using any other aspects of our intelligence that we're able to bring to bear. That means our emotional intelligence. It's a term that's been used a lot in the last decade. It refers to our ability to be aware of, in touch with our emotional experience, to be able to identify and communicate that experience when we want to, and at times to be able to regulate our emotional experience appropriately. Obviously, that's a big piece of what emotional sobriety is about, is connection to our emotions, but also being able to respond to our emotions in ways that are helpful rather than harmful to us in our life. It can also involve using our gut instinct level of intelligence. Our intuition is the word that I like to use. Our gut feel for what's going on in a situation. Sometimes the subconscious perceptions that generate those feelings about a situation or a person or ourselves are actually more lined up with reality than our conscious ideas are about what the truth is, what reality is. Tonight, I do want to shift gears a bit. In talking about living more consciously before, we have talked a fair amount about the practices involved in that, as we have with all of the practices involved in the 6 pillars of self-esteem, for instance, or when we were talking about the 12 steps, the practices involved in working the 12 steps. But we've talked a lot about what living more consciously is, why it means so much in terms of improving our emotional sobriety. But we haven't talked as much about the how, as much about how specifically do I address my issues and problems. Alan took us a little bit down this road last week in asking us to do some endings to those few incomplete sentences that we had talked about. And that is certainly one of the pieces of how. Those incomplete sentences can generate a lot of awareness, a lot of consciousness about our emotional sobriety and our blocks and obstacles to improve consciousness. So let's use our consciousness to examine and explore how we use and don't use our consciousness, right? That's really the task that we're about. The first point I want to make tonight, and Declan and Alan already referenced it in terms of, the importance of other people. We begin to live more consciously when we are humble enough to realize that we need and can utilize the help of other people to become more aware. Herb often points to this when he's speaking. Our patterns of self-protection lead us to have many blind spots regarding our own functioning, ways we shut down and emotionally protect ourselves. And we are very often oblivious to the ways we do those things. As you've heard us talk about, we've been protecting ourselves and defending ourselves and closing down our consciousness for so many years that it becomes automatic. These patterns can include behaviors such as substance abuse, avoidance and withdrawal, aggression, placating, distracting, obsessing, emotionally acting out, or conversely, denying our emotions altogether. So it's helpful and at times essential to have another person or other people assist us in this process of becoming more conscious, of learning to pay attention and being able to see what we were previously, without some help, unable to see. That person can be a mentor. For people in 12-step work, the person may be a sponsor. The person can be a teacher, a spiritual advisor, a professional therapist or a life coach, or even a good friend who we trust enough that we're able to hear them when they need to bring up something that they know is going to make us uncomfortable. So the first point is to be open to the support of others in the process of becoming more conscious. There's just too much we're unable to see. As Herb and Alan like to say, we don't see what we don't see. We can't see what we can't see. So ask yourself, am I able to ask for help from others? Can I be open to that? Obviously, my degree of self-acceptance is a big piece of whether I'm able to be open to that or not. If I have an idea of myself, that idealized self you've heard us talk about, that I'm supposed to be self-sufficient and self-reliant, it can be embarrassing to me. It can make me feel weak. I can feel ashamed if I ask for help. If I go to somebody and say, I'm not feeling good about what I just did, but I don't really understand it. Can you help me with that? If, on the other hand, I'm more accepting of my imperfection, more accepting of my character defaults, as we say, then I'm going to have a lot less trouble asking for help. So the how, regarding how do I improve my ability to live more consciously and therefore my emotional sobriety? How number one is practice asking for help and support and encouragement. How number two, practice mindfulness, also called mindful awareness, mindfulness meditation. As Nathaniel Branden put it, learn to be in the present moment without losing context, without losing the bigger picture. Now, mindfulness can be practiced at any time. Mindfulness, as I'm talking about it, simply means being aware of my experience, hopefully without judgment. Being aware of my experience, hopefully without judgment. Some people practice meditation regularly by sitting on a cushion or sitting on a chair. I honestly, at this point in my life, prefer walking mindfulness practice or walking meditation, it could be called. I've had some health issues I've been struggling with. It's really good for me to walk. And it's turned into a really great ritual for me. 20 or 25 minutes a couple of times a day. At times, I'll focus mindfully on my breathing. At other times, I'll focus on sensory awareness along the lines that Alan talked about last week when he talked about the modalities through which we make contact with other people, with situations, with the world, and even with ourselves. So I'll practice hearing, what I can hear. I'll practice seeing what I can see. I'll practice, being aware of my tactile sense or my olfactory sense. There are a couple of beautiful rose gardens on my walk where I live that I like to pay attention to. So I use all of that as ways to help myself come into the present moment and come to my senses. The creator of Gestalt therapy, Fritz Perls, had an expression: lose your mind and come to your senses. And what he meant by that is, let's not get so overbalanced toward our internal cognitive activity, our inner speech, our self-talk, that we lose touch with our sensory reality. We need to have a balance between those in our life. So the way this works as I'm walking is I'll be noticing what's around me, say if I'm attending to what's there visually, primarily, and I'll try to notice the colors and the shapes I'm seeing. And then within a few moments, always, reliably, my mind will wander. I'll start thinking about something else, right? Doesn't matter what it is. I'll start remembering something, or I'll start future fantasizing about something, or I'll start worrying about something, like clockwork. So the process is to simply notice that, and I'll usually say a simple single word for what I'm doing, thinking, or if some feelings are coming up, like I'm getting annoyed or bored or whatever, I'll just say the word feeling. So I'll just identify it briefly, usually just a single word, and then return my attention to my senses, to the present moment. And in a few moments later, it'll happen again. Our mind is a wonderful servant, but a terrible master, right? So that's the process, though. And if I just do it in that way, where I'm accepting of all my thoughts and all my mental activity as it arises, become aware of it, and just bring my attention back to my senses, the flow of my experience is not disrupted by any of that. If I have a powerful should around it, and I go, oh, I'm not supposed to be thinking about anything now. I'm supposed to be hearing sounds that I'm attending to or seeing what's in front of me. I'm supposed to be one with nature, and on and on. Now, all of a sudden, the flow of my experience is strongly disrupted, because I'm not just allowing what's unfolding to happen and then continuously bringing myself back to the present moment. So that's how number 2. A couple of other things that I wanted to add about that. When Brandon mentions being in the present moment, but without losing contact with our current situation, an idea that I think is very powerful is we can use any element of our experience in our life as a way to protect ourselves from and defend against any other element. If I'm in pain about something that's happened to me, but I judge my pain and I'm not accepting of it, but I'm a lot more comfortable being pissed off and aggressive because I feel stronger and in control and more energized and not helpless, on and on, right? Time after time, I'm going to use my anger as the cover story, as what I present to the world, rather than talking about the hurt that I'm in that underlies that anger. The opposite can also be true. If I'm a lot more comfortable with my pain and talking about it and sharing it than I am with being angry with someone or with myself, then my pain is what I'm going to present to the world. And I'm not going to be conscious of, or at least willing to disclose and talk about, the anger that I'm feeling. Even present moment awareness, as much as we talk about it, the same thing can happen. For a period of years, when I was first reading a lot of Eckhart Tolle and The Power of Now and stuff, whenever it was, 10 years ago, more than that probably, I got really good at present moment awareness. So good at it that I started using it as a way to check out in terms of, instead of taking a walk right now or sitting in a chair and meditating, I should probably be doing something to promote my work because money's really tight and I need to figure out a way to get more money coming in. And, walking around enjoying the beauty of the neighborhood I'm in was not helping me do that. So that's what I mean when I say we need to have a consciousness that allows us to have a larger view of our process. And that way we can avoid those kinds of pitfalls and be better balanced. One other very pragmatic note. I struggle with self-discipline in terms of exercise sometimes. And I'll go back and forth with different parts of myself about that. I won't be in the mood. I won't want to do it. I think most of you can probably relate. I think I should do it, but I really don't want to. A couple of months ago, for some reason, I started using the health app on my iPhone to measure the steps I take and how far I walk and various other things. From the moment I did that, I've had no motivational issues at all around walking, because what it plugged into is I'm a very competitive person. For years, I loved competitive sports, played a lot of them. Alan and I did battle on the tennis courts for many, many years. For some reason, when I see the numbers in front of me about what I've done, it's extremely motivating for me to want to continue to do that, to want to continue. So rather than get involved in all this struggle around, willingness or unwillingness and so on, I found another tool, another way that's been very helpful to me. This brings us to something I wanted to quote for you from Nathaniel Branden in his book, How to Raise Your Self-Esteem. There are two words that best describe what we can do to raise our self-esteem, which means to generate more self-confidence and more self-respect. Those two words are, as we've been saying, live consciously. But the problem with this statement is it may be too abstract for some people. It's not self-evident what that means in terms of what mental action, he calls it, within myself I may need to take, or what behavior, what physical action I may need to take. If we wish to grow, we need to know what to do. We need to learn new behaviors. So we must ask ourselves, if we practice living more consciously, in what ways would we be acting, behaving differently? End quote. The same question applies to emotional sobriety. If I'm going to help myself raise my emotional sobriety, what are the actions or the behaviors that I need to be talking about? But more than talking about, that I actually need to be engaging in. How number 3, about how to become more conscious. Describe clear, small behavioral steps that will help take you toward behavior that you want. I want to say that again. Take small, clear behavioral steps that will help take us toward the behaviors we desire. I want to read the way Alan put it in this chapter in his book, 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety. We don't suddenly, quote, live consciously. Waking up is a practice. With any practice, the key is small, steady effort. For example, a weightlifter doesn't get strong overnight. She improves her strength by practicing several times a week, increasing the amount of weight she lifts very gradually over months and or years. He gives another example of a trumpet player learning to improve their skills at trumpet playing. We use the same strategy in recovery and in emotional sobriety, I would add, that we use to live more consciously each day. We attempt to make small increases in awareness of the way we feel, of the choices we make, the actions we take, our habitual ways of feelings of thinking, and how well they accord with our innermost self. Over time, these small increases add up. Over time, we are aware of how and why we make the choices and take the actions that we do. Over time, with practice, we begin to live more consciously. Now, some other pieces of this issue, because to me, this is the most important piece of what I'm wanting to express or convey tonight. We often think that in order to change our consciousness, we need to change our awareness, that it needs to come from our head. And we do have enough awareness to know there's a problem, okay? And we do have enough acceptance of that to be willing to address the problem. But that doesn't mean we have to have great insight into the origins and the history and the sources of our problems in order to make progress with emotional sobriety, or more specifically tonight, with living more consciously. Changing our behavior, starting with our behavior toward a goal we desire, can change our consciousness. If I can choose any example, if I want to lose some weight, and I find a way behaviorally to begin to do that, all of a sudden what? I begin to feel differently. I may begin to see myself differently. With any goal that we can imagine for ourselves, including exercise, including mindfulness meditation, changing behavior can be a very powerful way to initiate change in our level of awareness. A couple suggestions I have around this issue of starting small, starting modestly. Think about what you want to do more than what you want to stop doing. Now, this is not by any means a hard and fast rule. Sometimes we have to think about what we need to stop doing before we can start to move toward what we want to do, who we want to stop being in our behavior before we can move toward who we want to become. But in general, for me and for many of my clients over the years, I find that stating our goals in positive terms helps me have a sense of positivity, of self-encouragement in moving toward what I want. The problem with negative directions is one you've all heard before. Don't think of a pink elephant right now, no matter what. Don't think of a pink elephant. Well, the paradox, of course, is in order to try to erase something from our mind, we first have to create the presence of it in our mind. And in subtle ways, that can be negatively reinforcing. So that's part of the idea behind why it can be helpful to have positive focus, to think about what we want. Suggestion number 2, be wary of expressing what we want in very general, abstract, non-specific ways. I want to be a better person. I want to be more loving. I want to be emotionally sober. I want to be less resentful or depressed or anxious or more serene. These ideas can be good starting points for us, but they only tend to be helpful if we make them much more concrete, much more specific. So if I give myself a goal that I've worked myself up to, if I want to walk a couple of miles a day, I know at the end of today, when I check in with myself about what I did, whether I walked 2 miles today, especially with the help of that app, right? But I don't necessarily know if I've been a kinder person today. I don't necessarily know if I've shown more emotional sobriety today. So it's very helpful to move away from very global kind of general, ideas about our goals to much more specific ones. Setting small, incremental, humility-based goals has other advantages. We want to create an experience of success that we can build on, that we can expand on. In seeing ourselves take action, we build self-trust and self-confidence from the ground up. As Herb would say, from what we see our feet doing, right? Not what we hear our words saying. The best basis for improved self-trust is in our own direct experience. We see and feel ourselves moving forward toward what we want. Another piece that's really important about the importance of taking small steps is it helps us believe that it's possible. And our belief about whether something is possible or not has everything to do with how likely we are to be able to move forward. An example I was reading earlier was a famous therapist who I love reading accounts of his work by, named Milton Erickson, was working with a young woman who'd been severely claustrophobic her whole life. Her mother had locked her in a cellar often when she was young and terrified her. And she could not stand being in small places, in closed spaces. So Erickson, in his office at that time in Arizona, he had a closet as part of his office, and he had her go in the closet with the door wide open. And he said, well, let's explore this together. So she said, well, I'm only going to go in if the door is wide open. And this was part of his genius. He said, well, I understand that, but would you be willing to go in if the door was 1 millimeter less than wide open? Now, a millimeter is about a 32nd of an inch. Okay, it's a tiny, tiny thing. There's no way a person can even really see the difference of a door open 1 millimeter more or less. So of course, what's she going to say? No, that's okay. A millimeter's nothing. So then he talked with her and checked out how anxious she was, whether she was panic stricken, because that's what happens for her. Little by little, millimeter by millimeter, and then inch by inch, checking in with her each step of the way, he had her control the closing of the door. So she had that sense of control, right? She closed it and closed it and closed it till the door was only open a couple of inches. And he was checking in with her the whole time. He said, how are you doing? She said, well, it's okay as long as I leave it open a crack and as long as I have my hand on the handle so I know I can open it. So then he said, is that as far as you want to go? And she said, well, no, let me try it. I'll close it all the way. And he said, well, why don't you try this? Look through the keyhole when you close it all the way, and I'll stand where you can see me. And she did that. And he checked in with her. And she was okay. In one session, she had made that much progress where she was in a dark, enclosed closet and wasn't very scared at all. Now, there are names for that in behavior therapy. It's called exposure therapy, or another name of a little bit different, where there's some relaxation training involved. It's called desensitization therapy. But that's a pretty remarkable difference for someone who had struggled their entire life. But he didn't sit with her examining the origins of her fear at any length at all. just a couple sentences. He helped her change her experience with her behavior, with her actions. So let me glance for a moment, if you will, to see if there was anything else that I wanted to mention. A small change can often lead to bigger changes, helping somebody, for instance, with a fear of driving on the freeway where I live in Los Angeles, and helping them move beyond that fear can obviously open up possibility for change in every other area of their life, socially, professionally, even opportunities for enjoyment and travel. A couple of suggestions I have in addition are to set small, achievable goals and to check in with ourselves at the end of the day to see if we did them or not. And if we didn't, have an attitude of compassion toward ourselves. Just inquire about why. What was that about? And try to find the answer to that rather than judging ourselves or condemning ourselves, which does not help. And then make adjustments to the plan and try again tomorrow. That's the process, foregoing all the self-criticalness and self-judgment. The final note is practice, practice, practice. That's how we institute new behavior and the changes in our consciousness that new behavior can help us have. So thank you all for your attention.
All right, Roger, thank you very much. God, you said so much. Herb, how many pages of notes do you have now?
4.
I knew it. I had a sense that you were going to have a ton of pages of notes.
I thought there'd be a lot less tonight because I tried not to be nearly as conceptual and more practical, you know.
Probably more, but it was fantastic. Look, you had a lot of great tips and you focused on the pragmatics. Herb, why don't you go and then I'll round it out.
And I'm certainly not going to make any effort to even give a distilled version of my notes. Thanks so much for this exposure, because it touches on so many things. And I'm going to just say a couple things because I can follow up next week and sort of amplify basically off of your notes and off of Dr. Berger's notes that I have. It's such the issue, consciousness. And I can look back now over my journey and see that I made such an effort to school myself, to get information. I mean, undergraduate work in philosophy, graduate work in psychology and theology, and in the program when I came into it, 4 years of effort at trying to understand the book and book studies and step studies. And you've heard me say it, but it's so relevant. And I did not know that I did not know, that I had no ability to observe what I was doing. I was just in the mix of doing it without any awareness. You use that term synonymous with consciousness. There was no reflective awareness of what was going on, reasonably consciously, but still not conscious of the consciousness. And then I met a man who shared differently, and even that though, my beginning, I don't want to expand this too much, but the very beginning in 1984 in the program was, it's just come to me, the experience of the mechanism that opened the door slightly to the consciousness, and the hospital program asked me a question. And that began my journey. A question that I could hear, that I was willing, you said it right up front, willing to listen to and take the action of, not knowing where it was going and not knowing it was very personal, but it was just part of the drill. and it was a question about me and my history with alcohol, doing a bullet point line of my history, what I did and what I drank and what the impact and the behavior and the outcomes over my 30 years of drinking, and then reading it out loud. That's the prototype from my standpoint. It's that simple.
Yeah.
I needed to be asked a question, though. So the Buddhists have a very nice way of saying anybody who really wants to be spiritual, and what they really mean is awake, or what they really mean is conscious or aware and self-aware, is they need a path, a teacher, and a community. The path, of course, we have the 12 steps, and there's many other paths that you all have experienced and have been talking about. And the teacher is either a therapist and or literally a teacher and or a sponsor, but it's somebody who has information and has experience that's willing to work with you and share that, asking questions, sharing some information, guiding you along the transaction of the action. And here's the biggest point from my standpoint, was accountability. It was so important for me to have somebody that gave me and I was willing to take the action. And then they asked me to tell them what I was thinking, what I was feeling, what the actions were. And all of that interaction, somehow I was willing to be reasonably honest, that was the consciousness maker. And I've used the term before, thawing out and or dimmer switch, because those are the two words that really characterize that. And there was I could describe, I won't here, all of the visible milestones over a 12-year period, doing it with 3 different mechanics, progressively becoming more conscious and having the depth of it. But you all know, and I've shared some of it here, it's still happening.
Yeah.
No, it's still happening. So we don't just become conscious. That's a process. That's not the destination. That is consciousness as an event. The destination is to become conscious. So the first 9 steps, for instance, and I'll stop with this, are for us to wake up. That's the purpose of the first 9 steps, to become conscious.
Yeah.
And then the next 3 steps are to stay conscious, to stay awake, because we have this tendency to fall asleep.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, Herb.
It's the bullseye. Yeah, thank you.
No, thank you, Herb. Especially, Herb, the accountability piece, and that other people can play a powerful role in helping us learn how to be more accountable, both to ourselves and to others. So thank you very much, Herb. Alan.
Well, what I want to do is tie this back into emotional sobriety, right? So I want to bring it back full circle. So how do we use our consciousness to improve our emotional sobriety, to develop a practice of emotional sobriety? So look, that's the intent of this workshop. It's a workshop on emotional sobriety. So we want to tie this in and make it much more practical to that issue. So it's a very, I think, simple suggestion. Pay attention to your habits, to the habitual way that you think, to the habitual way that you behave, to the habitual way that you feel. So that's the first thing. Try to notice these patterns to your behavior, to your feelings, and to your thoughts. Then pay attention to the patterns in your relationships. Now take your awareness, and instead of just focusing on what you're doing, pay attention to how you function in your relationship. How are you? And this is why I use this as the second insight, because increasing our consciousness or awareness is going to help us become aware of our emotional dependency, which is what we're going to be talking about in the next insight. And it is so critical. I can't emphasize this enough, to become aware of how dependent you are on the support of your environment. It's different than what Roger was saying. Roger was saying is that we need someone to bounce things off us and give us feedback. That I would consider a healthy relationship with our environment. We're being open to input. We're in this give and take kind of a dance. But what I'm going to be asking you to do is to use what we're talking about tonight to increase your awareness even by 5% of the habitual ways that you feel, the habitual ways that you think, the habitual ways that you behave. And then pay attention to how the patterns that show up in your relationships. Now, those are going to be revealed by you paying attention to the things that upset you the most. When you get disturbed, it's an opportunity. It's an invitation to looking at what are your unreasonable expectations? What are your unenforceable rules? And what claims and demands generate those things in your life? See, these are the things that we want to get to with emotional sobriety. So we're not just taking our awareness and meandering through life and paying attention. That this workshop is about taking your awareness and focusing, concentrating on the things that I've just identified. I will be talking about more about those when I come back, but tonight, Roger, thank you for such a great expose of consciousness and how we can use that. And the hows became very important tonight. And I just wanted to really kind of sharpen that focus on the emotional sobriety piece.
Great.
Does someone need to believe in God to successfully overcome addiction? Well, the way I like to think about what the program does, it connects us to who we really are. And what does that mean? Well, there's this incredible force in you and I, this growth force. It's the force that moved us from crawling to walking. You wanted to take those first steps. And when you fell, and you fell a lot of times, you didn't let your failures stop you. You picked yourself up, you learned from it. And how many times did you fail before you walked? You failed as many times as you needed to. You see that force, I call it a biological imperative, a psychological imperative, a spiritual imperative. It's moving you towards wholeness. It's moving you to be what you can be. Just like in the acorn is all the information it needs to become an oak tree. In you is all the information you need to become you. Become a you that can cope with life and to deal with whatever you need to deal with to be okay. And that's what I'll talk about in my new book, The 12 Essential Insights for Emotional Sobriety.